With a tyrant gone at Syracuse, what would happen next? Well, there was civil unrest, the rise of a rebellion, and a democratic plant-based process. Join me as I unpack the events on Sicily in the mid-5th century BC on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi, and welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode, I'm continuing my mini-series on ancient Sicily with a look at what happened after the fall of those tyrants at Sicily in the 460s, and then taking it through to the 440s BC. Before I start, the standard fare, which I'm sure you're familiar with by now. Please review and rate wherever you can. I've been slowly accumulating some great reviews lately. As mentioned before, I don't monetize this podcast. The only thing I ever ask for is for you to help spread the word. And there'll also be episode notes with maps, images, and that sort of thing, including a transcription on ancientblogger.com. You can find me on X, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube as Ancient Blogger. All ancient history content, by the way, apart from the odd photo of my dog. This podcast is also on X as @HoundAncient. And I've also recently created a subreddit on, Reddit. It's called Ancient History Hound, and you can find content on there as well. One final thing, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes on Sicily. I'll continue to refer to the native people on Sicily as Sicilians. You'll often hear Sicils, Sicanians, and Elymians used to refer to the separate indigenous ethnic groups there. It's useful in a sense, as these help differentiate from the Greeks and Carthaginians on the island. But there is a debate as to, how accurate these were. In any case, if you hear me say Sicilians, you'll know that I mean that diverse group of people who were there before the Greeks and the Carthaginians. Okay then, let's begin. Assuming you listened right to the end of the episode 2 on tyrants, you'll have heard me state that in the next episode I'll be including a character who was afraid of getting his hair cut. Well, I'm going to have to apologise, as I won't be getting to this character just yet. When I came to research and write this episode, I naively thought that I could cover a couple of major events and then get to the whole haircut thing in a single episode. But reality bites. There was no way I could break down and get into the two main events and everything else in one episode. In fact, these two main events require separate episodes, the first of which you're listening to now. It's also the reason why this episode covers a relatively short period, starting around 467 BC and finishing around 440 BC. To get some context and understand where this episode fits, I need to give a short summary of where we are. In the 6th century BC, the Greek colonies or cities on Sicily started to generate tyrants. These affected the whole of Sicily in several ways. For example, the competitive nature of those tyrants witnessed the expansion of some of those Greek city-states at the expense of the Sicilians. In the early 5th century BC, tyrants at Gela had come to control much of the eastern third of Sicily. One tyrant, called Gelon, captured Syracuse, and from this point it became the main player in Sicily, at least from a Greek perspective. The competition between tyrants exploded in 480 BC, when a fallout between two of them caused a Carthaginian army to become involved. This resulted in the Battle of Himera, which was framed by Diodorus Siculus as a confrontation between Carthage and the Greeks, which mirrored that of the mainland Greeks against the Persians, a sort of western front of that same big grand campaign. The reality was far from this bombastic narrative. True, a large Carthaginian force had been defeated, but as Herodotus reported, the reason they were there was to provide backup for one Greek tyrant against another. This wasn't exactly as Diodorus had set it out to be, but then Diodorus, like many historians and writers of antiquity, shaped the narrative in accordance with their worldview and their biases. Diodorus was a Sicilian Greek, and though he used earlier sources, we should always take into account that he could reframe events to suit his interpretation, and Diodorus Siculus is the main source that I'll be using here. When Gelon died, his brother Hieron had taken over at Syracuse. An action taken by Hieron, which factors into this episode, was the founding of a new city, Aetna. Though technically true, it was really the case of taking the existing colony of Catana, extending its borders, filling it with those loyal to Hieron, whilst removing large numbers of the population there, and calling it Etna. Hieron's rationale was to provide himself with a loyal base near to Syracuse and to achieve the status of a founder, which was a big thing in the Greek world. In 467 BC, Hieron died and power passed to his brother Thrasybulus, and he's depicted by Diodorus as the epitome of the villainous tyrant. Cruel, oppressive, and pretty much everything else you'd expect. Given that he lived near a volcano, Diodorus missed a trick in him not having a lair based within it. Perhaps this was the case, perhaps not, as mentioned in the previous episode, and it will form the content of a mini-sode on tyrants. A tyrant wasn't always a pernicious creature. Anyway, that aside, the Count of Diodorus and a comment by Aristotle points to the downfall of Thrasybulus after less than 1 year. Exactly why the people revolted against him might be because he was as Diodorus painted him to be. It might also have been because tyrants often spent a lot of time shoring up their power base and keeping it so. When one died, the new tyrant was often highly vulnerable. It didn't follow that people who'd been loyal to the old tyrant would throw their lot in with the new one. What we do know is that the revolt wasn't just from one demographic, the poor. Aristotle noted that those around him, and even members of his own family, decided they had had it with tyrants. In 466 BC, Syracuse was a place of civil revolt. On one side was Thrasybulus and his supporters, mainly mercenaries. On the other side was, well, everyone else. Let's call them the Syracusans for sake of ease. Understandably, the Syracusans realised that they were opposing a very dangerous group, especially as those mercenaries were skilled fighters. Keen to address the balance, they put a call out across Sicily for help. This was answered with cavalry and soldiers coming from Gela, Acragas, Selinus, Himera, and it wasn't just Greeks, even local Sicilians joined against the tyrant. It's tempting to view this response by the other Greek cities as indicative of a sense of loyalty, but perhaps there was something else going on here. Syracuse, as I mentioned, was the dominant power, and it had achieved this position through a series of tyrants. The other Greek cities may have reasoned that by ending tyranny, the power of Syracuse might be nullified. A weakened Syracuse versus one with a new tyrant, that would certainly serve them better. Eventually, the Syracusans won. Thrasybulus made a rare choice of a tyrant, or rare option they had, and the smart one. He agreed to leave the city and retire to Locri. Following this, Syracuse established a democracy. I'll get to that shortly, but peace didn't last long. Tensions now grew between two groups in Syracuse. The first was the newer citizens, those given citizenship under the tyrants. This was a common tactic which I've touched on in episode 2. In order to retain a stable base of support, it was a good idea to cram your city with those who are now obliged to you in some way. The second group were those families who'd been in place prior to the tyrants taking hold at Syracuse. This group had suspicions about the newer arrivals. Were they really committed to democracy? Or might they have loyalties which would lead to another tyrant? Also, be sure to add in some good old-fashioned snobbery. As such, they proposed that the offices of state should only be open to those older families, and you might imagine how this went down. Badly. It's true that some of the newer families may have sided with Thrasybulus or supported him, but there would also have been those who didn't. In any case, what resulted was another bout of fighting which was to last up until around 460 BC. Or at least, that's what Diodorus says happened. His narrative of these events seems blurry, and it has been argued that Thrasybulus hung around for a bit longer, and this round of infighting was, well, simply round 2. In any case, by 460 BC, it seems to have been over with the older families winning. Finally, you might think, a chance for everyone just to put their feet up and have a nice cup of tea. But you know that wasn't likely to happen. Into this mix stepped another character who will form much of the rest of this episode. Not a faction within Syracuse, a tyrant, or even a Greek. Instead, it's the chance to discuss Ducetius, a Sicilian who was to launch his own power grab in Sicily. Little is known about Ducetius, as most of our knowledge about him comes from Diodorus Siculus. It's stated that he was from a well-known family, and so was presumably educated accordingly. His emergence as a political and military threat dovetails with the fall of the tyrants of Syracuse, and so it's logical to assume that the political space which they left and the ongoing issues at Syracuse allowed Ducetius to make his move. Ducetius was based in the central eastern inlands of Sicily, and when Hieron had founded Etna, the assumption is that the lands which had belonged to the locals had been taken. Not that Hieron or any of the tyrants had been friends of the Sicilians to any great extent. As you heard, they joined in with Syracuse in opposing and overthrowing Thrasybulus. Etna, which had been populated largely by Hieron with his mercenaries and supporters, now looked highly vulnerable, and Ducetius made a move against it. But they were joined by Syracuse, which had its own reasons for an alliance. Syracuse had spent years fighting the supporters of their own tyrant, and just north of them there was this city populated with pretty much that same demographic. Perhaps this demographic had supported the unrest at Syracuse, but even if not, they still presented a possible threat. It may also have been that Syracuse feared what might happen if Ducetius and his local forces took Etna and became their new neighbours. In any case, the two forces allied and captured Etna. Before I get to what happened after the fall of Etna, here are some words from the Sicily History podcast. Just so you know, this isn't paid promotion. I'm doing a promo swap here with them and thought you might be interested in their podcast.
Hi, we're Laura and Caroline, and on our podcast, Sicily History, we talk senses.
Essentially, it's a drinking hand. There was some belief that plants might counteract the effects of alcohol.
That's wishful thinking, isn't it?
I think so. If you saw people walking in the streets wreathed, it means they'd either come from or they were going to a symposium.
We talk sources.
A good night's sleep? You have to be filthy rich to find rest in Rome. The endless traffic in narrow, twisting streets.
And yes, we are sisters. The sausage seller is going to be run off his poor little feet.
Guy, yeah.
How's he going to do it? He's going to need a troop of helpers.
The good thing about sausages is you can just throw them at people.
My word. It's good that you didn't go into hospitality.
Join us as we take a sensory trip through our favourite moments in time. Ancient Greece, Rome, and many more.
Sicily History, the podcast helping you see history in a different way.
Thanks to the Sicily History podcast there, although after listening to that I am reminded how sorely I need to up my promo game. Right, back to Etna and to the what next. Following their defeat, those at Etna were moved to Edessa, and this they renamed as Etna. I know, all the options they could have chosen. The site previously known as Etna was then reverted to its original name of Catana. It wasn't just the name though. The previous residents, forced out under Hieron, returned. They found his tomb there and smashed it to pieces. Elsewhere there were changes in the Greek cities on Sicily. The sons of Anaxilas, a tyrant who'd ruled Messina, were kicked out. In other Greek settlements and cities on Sicily, there was a sort of mass reset with all of those who'd been moved out due to political pressure, moving back in and taking back what was theirs. Of course, this all sounds very simplistic and asks more questions than it answers. What was returned exactly, and to whom? Syracuse had endured years of civil unrest struggling with this exact problem. Yet elsewhere, this was achieved without much hassle. Of course, Diodorus may have been sketching the very basics of what went on without actually going too much into the details. We have to remember that his history needed to entertain, and perhaps the various instances and manifestations of what went on were a bit dry for the audience. Diodorus was a bit more detailed with the goings-on back at Syracuse. The democracy was in place, though it's unclear what exact species of democracy this was. Aristotle commented that it wasn't until the later 5th century when Syracuse became a democracy, yet there were instances which I'll come to where we can detect the signs of a democracy in action at Syracuse. So what was Aristotle saying exactly? One argument has it that when Aristotle wrote this, he meant that it had become more of a standard democracy following some reforms made later that century. If so, then we may just be splitting hairs, as it wasn't just Diodorus who paints a democratic Syracuse prior to the end of the 5th century BC. In the next episode, you'll hear how Thucydides describes what seems to be an active democracy in action. I now come back to Ducetius and his campaigns in Sicily. An easy trap would be to fall into interpreting Ducetius as some Braveheart-esque rebel leader intent on unifying Sicily and fighting back against the Greeks. Now, it's certainly true that the Greek-Sicilian interactions have been getting more tempestuous, particularly with the rise of the tyrants, who were happy to take their lands. However, Ducetius had his own agenda, and as you'll see, this would also see him face off against his fellow Sicilians. It's more plausible and perhaps more accurate to think of Ducetius as a leader who is consolidating power amongst the Sicilian towns in that eastern central region, and doing it with both carrot and stick. After his attack on Catana, or Etna as it was known then, Ducetius refounded his hometown of Mene on the plain of Catana. Here, Diodorus referred to him as king, but this title isn't afforded to him again. Instead, he's labelled as ruler or leader. This could be read as Diodorus not being fully sure of what Ducetius was exactly. He was in charge, but of what, and what did that make him exactly? Whatever he was in charge of, and however it functioned, Ducetius was to bring it against another settlement in 459 BC. This time it wasn't a coastal Greek settlement, but a Sicilian one further inland. Morgantina was a famous Sicilian settlement which dated back centuries. Initially, the settlement was based on a hill known as Citadella. Greek influence had spread there from around the 7th century BC. In the 6th century BC, this extended to the adoption of Greek architecture and pottery. Morgantina may have been Sicilian, but a Greek visitor might recognise familiar structures and even the odd voice. Those outside of Morgantina could witness this through their coinage. A litra coin dating to the mid-460s, so prior to Ducetius, had an ear of grain on one side and the profile of a man with a beard on the other. The lettering on the coin was in Greek. In the mid-5th century BC, the older settlement was abandoned or perhaps destroyed, and a new one fashioned on Sierra Orlando. The new layout seems to have been influenced by how the Greeks were doing it. This new build may have been after Ducetius had stormed Morgantina and was possibly done by a Greek city. Perhaps Ducetius attacked Morgantina because of its Greek leanings, but that seems a whimsical reason to do so. It's more likely that he was striking out and increasing his power base in the eastern central lands of Sicily. After the success at Morgantina, Ducetius doesn't get mentioned by Diodorus for several years, but we do hear from him, though not before there's more political instability back at Syracuse. In 454 BC, there was an attempted coup by a character called Tyndaredes. Diodorus depicts him as using the tried and tested how to become a tyrant route to power, namely, gain a claim with the poor and seek to accrue a personal bodyguard. However, this failed. He was put on trial and executed. Following this, Syracuse put in place a process which had been used at Athens to mitigate a character rising to seize too much political power, the exact conditions a tyrant might emerge from. This was ostracism, albeit with a Syracusan twist. Replacing the pottery sherds upon which the names of potential candidates for exile were written, they used olive leaves. As a result, they called it petalism. Ostracism was a feature of ancient Greece which is well known, or at least the word is. The irony is that it wasn't that common. There's much of it which is debated. For example, when was it put into place exactly? I cover this and much more in an episode specifically on ostracism, so you can go and have a listen after this. But in the context of this episode, we might think of ostracism as a check against tyrants. This was particularly important at Athens after the introduction of democracy, or the early form of it, in the late 6th century BC, where such a situation might have occurred. The idea for ostracism was simple. Each year a vote was taken as to whether an ostracism was required, and if so, a vote was taken a few months later. There was even a number of votes required to legitimise the result, which, if successful, would involve that person being exiled for 10 years. Syracuse employed this process but changed a few bits. As mentioned, there was the name, but there was also the duration. If you were exiled, you only got 5 years. Unlike at Athens, where it lasted several decades, at Syracuse it was a short-lived affair. Diodorus noted the problem was that Syracuse was losing too many people to exile. Worse still, with the exile of all of these rich and obviously highly intelligent men, the democracy had fallen into the hands of demagogues and ruffians employing gutter politics. Note the sarcasm there. There are a couple of comments to make about this. The first is that this sounds exactly like the sort of criticism made against active democracies. And here I can point to the comment earlier made about how we think that Syracuse had that type of active democracy long before the end of the century. For the second point, I need to pick up that sarcasm again, because this comes across as very snobby. Naturally, all the rich nobles were excellent people, not a bad one amongst them. It may have been true that petilism had upset the political balance, but perhaps Diodorus was showing his own bias here. A year after the failed coup, we hear of Ducetius again. He hadn't been idle, and Diodorus referred to a Sicilian federation now under his control. The exact nature of this federation isn't clear, and herein runs the danger of Diodorus using a term which didn't accurately describe the nature of what Ducetius had formed. It's plausible that Diodorus didn't have the source material which he could accurately use to map out the nature of this organisation. In a way, it follows his uncertainty in what to call Ducetius when referring to him earlier as a king and then a leader and/or a ruler. We might speculate further on the composition of this federation. Was it formed of obliging towns and settlements? Or were some added to it who had little choice? I make this point purely to extend the one I made earlier, namely that Ducetius wasn't necessarily a Sicilian braveheart, more likely another political player who was operating with a different resource base, but intent still on extending his territory. It was in 453 BC that Ducetius founded a city, Palike. This wasn't random, it was next to a sanctuary to the Palici, who were worshipped by the Sicilians. The Palici were a pair of deities linked to the underworld. More specifically, they were linked to the hot waters found nearby. Locals would swear oaths at this location. It was really important to the Sicilians. By founding a city there, Ducetius was confirming his Sicilian credentials. The Palici had actually been on the radar of Hieron, the tyrant of Syracuse. When he founded Etna, he had Aeschylus write a play to be performed there. Though it hasn't survived, the fragments which have, and other commentary, indicate that the Palici were involved in the main plot. And it's been argued that Hieron was trying to bring them into the Greek pantheon. In 452 BC, Ducetius captured Etna, but not the original Etna, which had reverted back to the original name of Catana. This was the settlement of Inessa, which had been resettled following the success of Ducetius and Syracuse, and it was renamed Etna. The exact location of it hasn't been found, but it's mentioned by Thucydides as being between Catana and Centuripe. Ducetius was pushing his boundaries in more than one sense, and Syracuse must have wondered not if, but when, they'd have to deal directly with him. As it turned out, they didn't have long to wait. In 451 BC, Ducetius attacked Motium. Just in case that sounds familiar, it's not Motia, the Carthaginian city on the western end of Sicily. This was a small settlement with a garrison from Acrogas, the Greek city. As such, it's thought to have been located near to this Greek city. And don't worry, by the way, because I'll be putting maps up, as I said, on ancientblogger.com in the episode notes. Where Inessa or Etna had been to the east, this was further west. We can now understand this as a push to the west in terms of Ducetius extending his territory. This was the first incursion by Ducetius against a Greek city, and Acrogas called for help from Syracuse. Syracuse, perhaps realizing that it was paying for that necessary decision made in 460 BC, heard the call and sent troops. The Greeks and Ducetius clashed, and when it was over, Ducetius had won the day. This seems to have shocked the Greeks. Syracuse went so far as to execute the general in charge of their troops upon suspicion that he'd been bribed. This wasn't that unusual in terms of a practice. Generals weren't often executed by the Greeks, but they were held accountable, and this is another indicator that there was an active democracy in place at Syracuse. In fact, in the next episode, we'll hear of one general who was very concerned about what might happen if he returned to Athens having failed. The success of Ducetius was short-lived. A year later he was beaten at Nomae, another unknown location, but likely in the same area as Motium. With his army dissolving around him, Ducetius was forced to make a run for his life. The obvious place would be to return to the Sicilian interior, where he'd been building that support. I mentioned this in episode 1, but just so you know, the Greeks had largely settled on the coasts of Sicily. True, there were some sub-colonies established more inland, but these were there largely to secure trading routes to that interior, as well as mark out territory. Amongst the hills there, Ducetius could lick his wounds and plan. That would be the sensible option. But Ducetius did the exact opposite and made a dash to Syracuse. When he arrived, he made for the altars and declared himself a supplicant of Syracuse. The strategy here was that Ducetius was appealing to a Greek fundamental belief, that of being a supplicant and the possible safety it could afford him. Supplication can be thought of as a ritual where you place yourself at the mercy of a person, or in this case, a city. You may have heard of it elsewhere in Greek culture, be it in a poem or a play. This was an important ritual which was duly respected by the Greeks. By performing this action, he'd escape being made a prisoner on the battlefield, a fugitive who might easily be done away with. Now, though, the treatment of him might impinge upon the religious mores of Syracuse, and they had to consider him within this context. A debate was called. Killing Ducetius might now displease the gods and bring a stain on the city, so a compromise was reached. He was exiled to Corinth, the parent city of Syracuse, where he could live out his days, or at least that was the plan. His exile only lasted a couple of years. In 448 BC, he was back, this time as the founder of another city on Sicily. On the northern shore of Sicily, the settlement of Caeli Actae was founded, and this has been argued as modern-day Chaeronea. The rationale for Ducetius to settle here was given as the result of an oracle he'd received. However, this feels, at best, a cover story. Given that he arrived with colonists and other support, this wasn't an escape from Corinth, no nighttime journey aboard a merchant ship in disguise. What seems most plausible is that he was returning to Sicily with the backing of Corinth and Syracuse, and with a specific job to found that new city. But why was this, though? Well, we can only avail ourselves to speculation, but there is a thread of logic which can be found here, and it starts way back when Syracuse first allied with Ducetius in 460 BC. Remember that at the outset they had been allies, and that alliance had benefited both parties. After this, Ducetius hadn't bothered Syracuse much at all. The closest he'd come was taking that settlement renamed Aetna, the one which was previously Enessa. Yes, this was closer to Syracuse than it might like, but it was still within reason. The following actions undertaken by Ducetius had been to the west, not on Syracuse's doorstep. Consider also what Ducetius did after he was defeated. His rationale to arrive at Syracuse might have been seen as outrageous. Why not seek the safety of the Sicilian interior? Well, perhaps it wasn't that safe. Perhaps the power base he built there was fragile, and with his defeat he realised that he was a marked man wherever he might go. Best then to risk it with Syracuse, where he might plead with them as to him not being a direct enemy. Syracuse was a democracy, so perhaps he had support there. We can speculate further. Perhaps the deal struck with Syracuse and Corinth involved him returning at some point to found a colony with the knowledge that he could be a useful ally on the island. True, his power base may have gone. We don't know if there had been tensions within the Sicilian interior following his defeat, and his return might act upon these to bring support back to him. Founding a city would benefit Syracuse and Corinth. It would also be highly valuable to have a popular Sicilian leader allied to them. This is all speculation, but it does form a coherent policy. It allowed Syracuse to control some of the Sicilian population, and this was an important issue. In episode 2, I mentioned how Camarina, a sub-colony of Syracuse, had risen against it. The reason for this, we are told, was a sub-colony allying with Sicilians against its parent city. All of this might have looked good, but it didn't go down well with one Greek city on the island. Acragas was seething. Not only had Syracuse let Ducetius live when they had him in their grasp, he was now back, and presumably with the blessing of Syracuse. They had not only failed to exact justice upon Ducetius, but Syracuse was now using him to advance their political position on the island. It's easy to see why Acragas was so angry. The result was a battle fought at the Himera River between Syracuse and Acragas. Diodorus wrote that other Greek cities joined in on either side, but sadly doesn't mention which ones. It was a furious engagement, with Syracuse emerging victorious. Ducetius, with his colony founded, seems to have made a power bid amongst the Sicilians once more. Perhaps this was part of the deal, with Ducetius allowed to return to Sicily, found a city, and then move back to his heartlands, where he could act as an ally to Syracuse. Perhaps Syracuse had been duped, and Ducetius had decided that he had unfinished business. His next action would answer that question, but it never came to be. In 440 BC, he fell ill and died. So ended the life of Ducetius. Ducetius provided a unique character and perspective on ancient Sicily, the view and motivation from a Sicilian. It's a great shame that we don't know more about him. As ever, perhaps one day we'll come across something which can help fill the gaps and adds more flesh to this intriguing character. And with that, I come to the end of this episode. In the next episode, I can promise you more tales of mainland Greek city-states getting all up in Sicilian business once more. This time on a much, much larger scale, with disaster and misfortune in tow. The Athenian expedition to Sicily is a story in itself, and one which I'll be unpicking. Make sure you subscribe to avoid missing out. But more importantly, and until then, keep well and stay safe.